Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a while. This is Dr. Luke Johnson, and Dr. Jonathan Cook is joining me today to discuss some Jack London. We're going to be talking about Jack London's The Iron Heel. Initially, we were going to talk about the Star Rover, the jacket, which I really enjoyed, but Dr. Cook made a change here, and I'm glad he did. And I was just telling him before we went on air that I keep a running tally of my favorite books of the year. And right now, the number 1 and number 3 spots are held by Jack London. The jacket and then the Iron Heel. But I quite enjoyed the Iron Heel, even though I'm giving it currently the ranking of 3rd. What made you want to talk about the Iron Heel rather than the jacket, Dr. Cook?
Iron Heel is a great, dystopian novel that had some influence on Orwell in 1984 and really said some interesting things about America at the beginning of the 20th century and the huge concentration of wealth that was occurring at the time that really reached a peak before the beginning of reform under Roosevelt, when the trust started getting broken up. So we're kind of duplicating that era now in the U.S. I mean, this massive concentration of wealth and the power of oligarchy. London talked about the oligarchy is the ruling power. The Iron Heel is the nickname of the oligarchy. So when you talk about oligarchies, you think, Russia, the oligarchs, very topical today, for the last 20 years. Russia has been heavily influenced, not ruled necessarily, but dominated by these extremely wealthy men. But also, you could consider the so-called robber barons, the incredibly wealthy individuals of the late 19th, early 20th century. The Carnegies, Rockefellers. Gould, and in California, the great wealth of Stanford and the creators of the whole oligarchy in California are what London knew best because that's where he lived. But the fact is that this book sort of provides a spooky blueprint about how fascism comes to America, which is something we all need to be aware of today. But the fact that these super powerful industrialists, eventually they say, hey, we don't want to not only be rich, but we want to control the government. So they form this kind of oligarchy, so-called, and dominate the country and become kind of a de facto totalitarian element that rules in America. And since the narrative is set up to be telling the story, 700 years in the future, it's looking back on the struggle between socialism and oligarchy that resulted in the domination of the oligarchy for 300 years, and then for the last 400 years they've had the so-called BOM, Brotherhood of Man. So anyway, my chief reason is just the suggestiveness it has for our situation today, which is always a good reason to reread something.
Yeah, it seems to be perpetually tapped into cycles of history. You were thinking about it in terms of its relevance for today. I mean, I was telling Dr. Cook before we went on the air, I had a rather ill-conceived understanding of who Jack London was. I really hadn't a lot of people ringing the bell saying, hey, you got to ring this guy, before Dr. Cook brought it to my attention. And the reason why I enjoyed both of these novels so much is how much they dip into the sci-fi. I guess I'm more of the sci-fi guy between us. Yeah. And what we see is something very Wellesian with Jack London here. He's predicting the future. He's like a prophet in
Yeah.
some ways. I believe, if memory serves me correctly, he, I guess kind of predicted that Hawaii would get attacked. He said
Yeah,
that
right.
Hawaii,
Yeah.
he said that Hawaii would get attacked on
By
December 4th, 1912 by like Germans or
Germans,
something.
yeah. Initiating
Not
a
too
war.
far off.
Yeah.
Not too far off.
Yeah.
Not too far off.
Yeah, I mean,
It's like he's got access to some kind of spooky blueprint.
well, I mean, he read H.G. Wells, and actually, there's a little bit of when the sleeper wakes in this novel, in the Iron Heel. The sleeper wakes involves this huge struggle between these kind of mysterious entities, this massive kind of dominating, brutal power called the White Council, and then all of these. The rest of these people who are banded together in rebellion, and it's, this guy sleeps 200 years into the future from around 1897, right? That's when it's set. A guy falls asleep and he wakes up basically in the 203 years later in the 22nd century. So Wells influenced. London the way he was influencing many people in the 1890s and early 20th century. But there's also, of course, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, which was a utopian novel from 1888, which was addressing the problem of massive inequality and labor conflicts from the 1880s. And his novel, Looking Backwards, projects someone who sleeps into the future and looks back and sees the country, the U.S., evolving into a benign socialistic republic with all of the rich people agreeing to change their ways. So it's a sort of idealistic vision of the future that London purposefully, denied in his book because he thought there was going to be definitely class war, class conflict. He was much more of a Marxian than Bellamy. Bellamy was a kind of middle-class idealist who was still very influential. There were all kinds of Bellamy clubs, and actually the People's Party, the Populist Party of the 1890s, really emerged out of a lot of Bellamy's ideas about progressive taxation and public ownership of utilities and all these wildly liberal ideas at the time. So Bellamy, everyone was reading Looking Backwards and published in 1888. So London definitely knew that book well, and he knew H.G. Wells. So he was working in a genre, the science fiction of sleepers waking up in the future and seeing either a vision of positive change or looking back on what happened in the past, which is, London's book. This book takes place between 1912 and 1932. Most of it is in around 1912, 1913. Of course, it was published in 1908, so London is projecting a few years ahead into the future to imagine what's going to happen, imminently in the U.S.
Yeah, I was poking around and doing a little bit of research earlier today, and I saw that Orwell thought very highly of him, like you mentioned. Do we know if Huxley or any of the other dystopian writers were interested in his work?
I think it's mainly Orwell, the idea of this massively oppressive collective of wealthy people. Of course, 1984, Big Brother, it's not as though they're particularly wealthy, the state, but it definitely has this brutality in its approach to governing that that London conveys in the book. I mean, we have a lot of violence described. It's not really intricately detailed. We don't have, ghastly scenes of bloodshed, and I mean, we see scenes of fighting and people being killed, but it's not really that detailed in its representation. But I think the image, when O'Brien in 1984 says, tells Winston Smith that, our power over people is like think of a boot stamping in someone's face perpetually, something like that, he says. And I think he sort of got that idea from the idea of the iron heel, meaning a foot that stamps on you or stamps on your face, stamping you down, keeping you down forever.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always an intriguing irony. I mean, I'm an apolitical person, but I can see the real concern against fascism, but to be an advocate of socialistic Marxism or something like that, I mean, I guess that requires tremendous faith that that apparatus will never turn against you, and that what was once something that really benefited you became that iron heel as well.
Yeah,
I'm curious why.
London eventually quit the Socialist Party before he died in 1916. He thought that they weren't active enough, but I mean, we easily forget that the Socialist Party in the U.S. was growing enormously at the beginning of the 20th century because of the incredibly oppressive conditions of people in working class vocations, and the fact that you had child labor all over the place. You still had people working in factories and mills 12 hours a day. You had this Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911 in New York, where over 100 women were burned because of lack of safety protocols. You had all kinds of labor disputes in the 1880s, 90s. In 1905, the governor of Montana was blown up because there was a lot of friction between the miners, Western miners, and the government, and so somebody dynamited.
Wait, what happened? A governor got dynamited?
The governor of Montana was blown up by dynamite, and they immediately arrested the 3 leaders of the Western Federation of Miners without any evidence that they were involved. I mean, they just assumed they must be guilty. So they were arrested and brought back to Montana, basically kidnapped. And they were tried and convicted, and then eventually it turns out the guy who did the actual dynamiting was only loosely connected with the mining union. He was just kind of a lone wolf, and so London was very much aware of that, and he also was very much aware of the Haymarket tragedy of 1886, where during a march of labor rights, someone threw a bomb that killed several policemen, and they convicted several of the labor leaders without any tangible evidence of their responsibility. It's considered the Haymarket tragedy, scandal, whatever. It made huge impact on Americans in the later 1880s about the labor problems, where there was such a polarization between labor and capital, constant strikes. Had the Homestead Steel Mill strike in 1892, the Carnegie Mill that, we had Pinkerton cops shooting strikers. Anyway, very bloody chapter of American history we don't really know that much about. Most people don't know much about. London was very much aware of it, and he totally sympathized with the working class because that's where he came from. I mean, he grew up as a boy. He sold newspapers. He worked in a cleaning facility, where they washed they did laundry in. He spent hours and hours doing that. He worked in a jute mill. He worked as an oyster pirate in the Bay of San Francisco. He went at the age of 17. He went out as a cabin boy or deckhand on a sealing expedition to Japan and back. And then he went up to the Klondike to look for gold. At the age of 21 with his family relation. So definitely a man of the working class who very much knew the exploitation of labor at the time when you had just almost no laws protecting workers in terms of injury, in terms of child labor. All these laws came in the early 20th century, and even during the New Deal, to protect
Well, this
workers.
prompts the question. A man of such diverse life experience.
Yeah.
I'm curious how he developed such an elegant style. I don't know how I would describe how he writes, but it's effortless. It's like he's not really trying, but it's still great.
He was
haven't really
incredibly
tried to
well
put it
read. Yeah, I mean, he has a very sort of lucid, sincere style that, it's eloquent, but it's also very hard-hitting, polemical when he needs it to be. So he was massively well read. I mean, he was reading as a teenager. He did one semester at Berkeley, but he had to drop out because he couldn't afford it. But he just loaded up on books throughout his whole life. I mean, he knew all the important thinkers of the time. He's very influenced by Nietzsche, by Darwin, by Thomas Henry Huxley.
I think he name dropped Spencer in this book.
Yeah, Spencer. Herbert Spencer, who was the big, very popular sort of Darwinian interpreter who's responsible for what we call social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest was his phrase, which Darwin eventually picked up and used. But so Herbert Spencer's London eventually got over his ideas because in the beginning, London, was a powerfully strong young man who thought he could conquer the world, and so he thought, he embraced Spencer's ideas like the best people deserve whatever they can get, the successful people. I mean, Spencer was used to justify the massive wealth of the plutocrats of the later 19th century, but London eventually, when he discovered real poverty all over the world. I mean, he went to London, wrote a book about poverty in London called People of the Abyss, a very interesting and moving book. That's when he realized that Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism was bullshit because, people have bad luck and they get sick or they...
Oh, yeah.
Get
sucked into a machine, get their arm ripped off.
Get their arm ripped off like the guy Jackson in the book. Yeah, so just because you think you're on top of the world today and you deserve everything you can make, if tomorrow you get, run over and you can't go back to your job, what happens then? You beg on the streets the rest of your life, or do you have some kind of mechanism to support you until you can recover or maybe do something else? So, this really ruthless Darwinian world of late 19th century capitalism was really hurting a lot of people. The wealthy people, of course, flaunted their wealth, and it was popularized in all the press and newspapers and whatever, but not so hidden away in the cities and rural areas were many, many Americans who were poor and suffering and even unable to feed themselves. So he knew that world, and he wrote about it in books like People of the Abyss and The Iron Heel and The Road, which was about a nonfiction book about his trip in 1893-94 with so-called Coxey's Army of the Unemployed, who went across the country to go to Washington. They marched across the country to demand jobs because they couldn't take care of themselves. And London was part of that army, and he got arrested in around Buffalo and spent a month in jail. And he had the humiliation of being thrown into jail for the only offense was that he couldn't declare a place where he lived. He was basically homeless, and so they put him in jail for a month, in a penitentiary actually. So that's where he got the experience of the Star Rover, actually, when he's putting on the character there is putting on the straitjacket.
Yeah.
He knew he was a prison reformer from that experience.
That was a wild book.
Yeah.
So I think we've touched on the general narrative, but we probably should feed the audience a little bit more about what the story is about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the book pretends to be a manuscript, a discovered manuscript that's presented by a guy named Anthony Meredith.
Right.
In the year 2700, saying,
which is a man's name.
Yeah.
Anthony Meredith.
Yeah.
But not to be confused
with
Avis.
Avis, yeah. So Meredith is publishing the story with his footnotes to explain terms and ideas from the early 20th century that he thinks his readers wouldn't understand. So he's interpreting for the audience of the future the world that's described in this manuscript by Avis Everhard, and about her life with her husband Ernest. First it's their fiance, then later her husband. And I was reading that Ernest Everhard was actually the name of a cousin of London's that he met in Michigan. So he took the name from someone who was his own family. Of course, Ernest Everhard is sort of a projection of London himself. And of course, Avis that would make Avis Charmian his second wife. So anyway, the novel pretends to be a discovered manuscript that was written by Avis Everhard about her experience getting to know this guy Ernest and marrying him, and then learning about Ernest's view of contemporary America and why he is a socialist, and educating her about the sufferings of the poor and the oppressed in the San Francisco area at the time, which is where it takes place largely. So it has two time frames. This frame of the future, which is hundreds of years, 700 years in the future. Just kind of weird to make it that far. I mean, I can understand 100 or 200 years, but 700 years, that's a huge leap.
Right.
But so the story is mainly about the struggles of Avis and Ernest to survive in an increasingly menacing world of the plutocratic oligarchs and their eventual control of the government, because they pretty much take over in about 1912, and Ernest and Avis take part in an uprising in Chicago a while later, which fails. It's crushed by the Iron Heel, and they spend time in prison, and the end of the book is they've escaped, and they don't know what the future's going to bring, but it kind of breaks off. Supposedly in 1932, it's not really the time frame gets a little hazy after a while. After you start the novel, start the sequence, which clearly begins about 1912. So the book is sort of educating the reader about why Ernest is a socialist and how the oppressive rich people of the time can assume control of not only industry but also the media, government, and they kind of they corrupt the working class by favoring some unions eventually and buying them off, and then to be able to crush other workers. So if all of this sounds very outlandish, it's kind of sobering to think that, you know, there are a lot of wealthy people out in America today who would like nothing more than to, you know, assume control of the government. In fact, if you read some books of Jane Meyer, you know, called a book called Dark Money, or I just read a book of Nancy McLean called Democracy in Chains, about the idea of, you know, billionaires and millionaires, you know, basically whittling away, getting rid of all the laws that have been passed to protect labor, to protect women, to protect minorities, and just kind of unleashing the power of capitalism without any kind of mitigating factor to lessen what it does to those who don't benefit from it. So, you know, you could look around today and, you know, dig up things in the library that would sort of alert you to some trends that are ominously suggestive of this book.
Well, I think it raises an interesting question. If people can't be bought, are there other ways for bending people's wills?
Like,
you know?
what? If they can't be bought?
Well, you know, not everybody's driven by money.
Well, yeah, I agree. But
So
everyone has to live. You know, you need money to be able to survive.
Right. I'm just saying that there's possible other ways to subvert.
Yeah.
But that's another subject. And it's not just, you know.
Well, the thing is, in this book, you know, Ernest Everhart tries to work within the system. I mean, he gets elected to Congress along with a bunch of other socialists.
Right.
But the oligarchs don't like that. The Iron Heel sets him up, and when he's giving a fiery speech in Congress with Avis in the audience, a saboteur throws a bomb for which Ernest is deemed to be responsible. So that's the thing about the Iron Heel, is they're very good at you know, agents provocateurs, you know, creating false flag kinds of situations where they can deny their responsibility or provoke some kind of violent response without being directly known to be doing that.
It raises an interesting question. If there were false flags going on, like, how would we even know?
Yeah.
Like, how would we determine which, you know, who's doing what if the origins are mysterious?
Yeah. Well, it takes a lot of diligent research, you know. I mean, you gotta. It takes time and information, you know. I mean, like today, just with Ukraine, right? The Russians were creating all kinds of attempts to create provocation by setting things up, and the U.S. was, you know, exposing what some of their provocations would be. You know, creating false narratives about how the war began, rather than direct invasion, which is what they did. You know. So, massively powerful entities often are very good at creating, you know, false flag operations, propaganda, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
In the book, you know, the oligarchs contain the press. You know, the press can't publish, for instance, everything that you know, this guy Jackson has his arm pulled off at his mill,
right,
and he can't win his case because the oligarchs have they have a very good lawyer, and they talk to the foreman of the mill, saying, what happened. Of course, this guy was to blame for his own accident. And when Avis later on tries to call attention to this, she can't get people to pay attention to her. And then when this guy Bishop Morehouse, who's a Christian bishop who kind of sees the light because of Ernest's educational efforts, he's completely, he's put into a madhouse because they don't want to listen to him. And everything he says about the struggles of the poor, they don't publish it because the journalists are afraid. They can't really publish the truth, which is a terrible thing.
What's the biblical scripture about the prophet being hated in his hometown?
Yeah.
Mark 6:4.
Yeah.
But Jesus said unto them, a prophet is not without honor, but is in his own country and among his own kin and in his own house.
Yeah.
I think that's true with the bishop.
Well, what he's trying to say is too threatening for the oligarchs because they don't want to pay attention to the safety of their workers because they make more money by ignoring it. They don't want to improve conditions because they're making too much money as is.
Did London receive any pushback for publishing stuff like this? I mean,
it's interesting. The book was not well reviewed, but I mean, he sold 50,000 copies of it, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
But he was a very popular author. I think people really weren't fully aware of what he was doing in the book. I think people, it is a kind of a clunky narrative in terms of its
the shifting perspective.
Yeah. There's this vagueness about some of the descriptions, a lot of concentrated history. So it's not a first-rate book like 1984, but it's an interesting book, and it's got some really interesting, vivid moments, and it's sort of. I was reading in the criticism as it was kind of like a. Uncle Tom's Cabin wake-up call for people about industrial misery. I mean, there have been a lot of these books. London was really instrumental in helping Upton Sinclair publish his book The Jungle in 1906, and they were friends. It was part of a movement to dramatize really the misery of the working class that he and Upton Sinclair were doing at this time. And of course, the Iron Heel was published in 1908, written in 1906. So it sold, and it didn't get good press. I think mainly because it wasn't entertaining enough.
I found it pretty entertaining.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't compare to his other writings, which were more accessible. Like White Fang. White Fang is a wonderful book. It's right there. Very enthralling story, great narrative, thrilling.
I'm gonna have to read everything that Jack London has done because if the Jacket or the Star Rover and the Iron Heel are considered like
lesser books.
Slept on works. I can't imagine what his other stuff is like.
He's a brilliant short story writer. I think most people think of him as really best in the short stories. So his South Sea Tales, just amazingly interesting work. His Tales of the Klondike, great fiction. And then
I'd come across that When the Sleeper Awakes before. That title was very intriguing to me.
Well, we talked about it, right? Didn't we talk about doing it a while ago?
I may have suggested it because I came across it doing some research, or I can't remember who said. Oh, I think maybe I sent it to you. You had been talking about London, and then I came across that, and I was like, "Hey, can we do this one?" You're like, let's do these others." But I'd be down for checking that one out. It's very curious. Jack London, he died on November 22nd It's a very interesting day
Yeah.
in literary and political history. I mean, I know you know what happened on that day. A lot of things happened on that day.
Was that Kennedy's assassination?
Yeah, it was the day
Yeah.
of the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah.
And Aldous Huxley died the same day as the Kennedy assassination. So, I think C.S. Lewis. Yeah, C.S. Lewis.
So yeah,
And, Jack
1916.
London.
It's terrible because he died at the age of 40. You know, he was in prime condition until the year or two before. What happened was when he went on his South Sea voyage, in 1907, you know, he built this boat called the Snark and sailed off with Charmian and a small crew because he wanted to go around the world. But he ended up only in the Pacific. He went to Hawaii, spent time there. He went to the other parts. He went to Tahiti, Solomon Islands. But he got ill, very ill, something called yaws, which is a spirochete like syphilis, except it's not a venereal disease. But it causes these huge rashes on your skin. And he treated himself with these ointments that had mercury in them. So basically, when you get mercury in your body, it doesn't go away. So it ended up in his kidneys. So he had basically, in 1916, his kidneys just started breaking down, and he died of like a combination of stroke and kidney failure and heart attack because of this mercury in his system. That was terrible, and he didn't know about it. He didn't know the consequences of it.
So many great men have been done in by the mercury.
Yeah.
How many astronomers and men of science and I guess writers?
And Melville's older brother Gansevoort probably died of mercury poisoning.
That's incredible.
He had a tanning business where they used mercury in the tanning process. So anyway, London could have written many more books. He was very prolific, but he died. 1916.
It's wild. I was going to mention Anthony Burgess also died on November 22nd, as far as writers go.
Well, I had no idea.
Yeah, it was wild. Why did he name his ship the Snark?
The Snark is from Lewis Carroll.
I was going to say, it's a reference.
Yeah. I forget which. It's not through the Looking Glass, I think. Something like that. Anyway,
there's like a story I believe in Through the Looking Glass
Chasing
called
of the Snark, Hunting the Snark.
Hunting
right.
the Snark.
Yeah.
Was he particularly fond of Lewis Carroll? Is there a connection there?
I don't really know. I mean, I just think it was common knowledge. Carroll's Alice books were. But he read everything, so he knew Carroll. Yeah.
I'm going to make a little note of that. Nice. So so London's pretty critical of American democracy. What did he want to see instead?
Well, he was a committed socialist, and it's interesting, of course, the socialism of his era had never been.
What does that mean?
It pretty much was a lot of what we have today, which is, public ownership of utilities, old age pensions, free public education, retirement funds, things that really mitigated the horrors of the era, when everything, you were pretty much on your own. I mean, there was public education, but if you went to college, you had to pay a fair amount of money at the time. And so pretty much, socialism was kind of what we got with the New Deal. It wasn't complete. I mean, in the book, it makes it sound like it's hardcore Marxism, pro-working class ownership of the means of production. But in fact, the socialism that was talked about was more about, making life livable for everyone. So, it was a certain naivete because this was before the Russian Revolution. We had no idea what it was like to live under a socialist government with one-party system. And there was a certain naivete about it, but it was very popular with middle class reformers. I mean, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward is pretty much is based on a vision of socialism for the future. I think it was it was just an alternative to this horrible, massive concentration of wealth at the top, with no income tax at the time, and just these massive fortunes that these people, they didn't need. I mean, they just built houses and bought art and wasted money on extravagant, yachts, just like the Russian oligarchs, or Jeff Bezos, or
I was gonna say, what do you think Jack London would say about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos trying to colonize space? So what do you think he would say about that?
I think he would think of them as sort of part of the Iron Heel,
Yeah.
I mean, they, underneath it all, I mean, look, Jeff Bezos, they've just investigated Amazon warehouses where, people have repetitive motions and they get, they get muscle, physical disabilities from repetitive work. They work long hours. I mean, I don't think it's much fun to work in an Amazon warehouse, personally. Elon Musk, I don't know so much. I mean, I don't know what it's like to work in a Tesla factory. I mean, it's probably all robots doing the work. But I think he'd have the same attitude. I mean, these people aren't, as mean as a Rockefeller or some of these other, super wealthy people, Morgan, and I'm thinking of the, Pennsylvania, the Pittsburgh banker, the Mellons,
Yeah.
they're not as mean and notorious, but they still their opinions and I mean their actions still cause difficulties for people, and they if you work your whole life for Amazon, you're not going to be rich at the end of it, I can tell you that. So anyway, that's why things are very similar today. We have lots of billionaires out there who have a lot of power, political power. They can buy their own candidate and run them. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Fortunately, they have a fair amount of independence in what they write. But I don't think they can say many bad things about Amazon. That's for sure.
That would be quite the bind for the editor. I don't know if that editor would last very long.
Yeah. So.
Well, we touched on this a little bit. How he got some things right about the development of fascism.
Yeah,
I believe not just in Europe but in other places. Wasn't there a fascist that was Allende that kind of like was on
Allende?
the cover of the book?
He was on the cover of the book. Yeah. What? Allende in Chile in 1973, overthrown by the CIA. Pinochet came to power. Of course, the CIA helped the military with their coup, but it was pretty ruthless. And Allende, it's interesting because most people don't know that he completely restructured the Chilean economy by bringing in a lot of free market people from the U.S. Milton Friedman's ideas about the rights of plutocracy and the very conservative economic ideas, and kind of screwed up their Social Security program, which they're still recovering from. Kind of made a huge transfer of wealth to the upper classes with Pinochet. And Pinochet, of course, himself got pretty wealthy too. So that situation, suggestive of what London was describing. But fascism began in the 1920s in Italy, not long after this book was published. and it involved a sort of nationalistic fervor and capitalistic collaboration with government and the use of violence with unapologetically and the control of the press. It's the idea of this sort of capitalistic enforcement of the power to benefit only the few, came into existence. Not what about 15 years after London published this book. After World War I, Italy, and then eventually in Germany, and then Spain. So he did not live to see fascism, but he sort of projected it for the future.
Right. Well, it's definitely a seer of sorts.
Yeah.
I guess you don't hear that with London. I guess it's like Wells who kind of always sucks up the prophet status, but
Yeah.
London seems to have...
He was a great reformer too. I mean, everything he did he was kind of a benefactor for humanity. I mean, he had this beautiful ranch in Glen Ellen and Sonoma, north of San Francisco, and he had these very sort of well-developed agricultural ideas about breeding and humane treatment of animals and avoiding the exhaustion of the soil that happened in some of these other parts of the Central Valley of California, where you had this wheat baron at the time who was just would use up these lands and would not rotate his crops and everything. So he's a great agricultural reformer. He's anti-imperialist. He learned about the oppressions of colonialism when he sailed around the Pacific and talked to all these native peoples, and what happened when the French or the English or the Americans came in and took over. And he was a critic of industrialism in the U.S. So a generally, wonderfully inventive and productive friend of humanity, and great writer.
Is this your favorite of London's work, or how?
No,
what's your list?
My ranking.
What's your top 3 or 5?
Well, I love his South Sea Tales.
Yeah.
Because it kind of reminds me of Melville's writings in that area.
Well, I figured that much.
And I love his other nonfiction books. The People of the Abyss is really interesting. You could compare it to Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London. It's about the East End in England in the beginning of the 20th century and the massive poverty there. Sure. Also, the John Barleycorn, which is an autobiographical story about London and his drinking. But it's really just a sort of meditative view of life in general. It's not, he did not have he probably drank a lot, but he was not seriously alcoholic. Also, The Road, which is about his trip with Coxey's Army in 1893-94. That's a wonderful book. So I love his nonfiction.
It sounds like you're a real London head. Sounds like you've read pretty much everything he's done. Did you go through a big phase?
I went through a phase, but believe me, he's written a lot, more than you realize. He wrote about 20 novels and about 50 short stories, and about four collection of essays. But the ages of about 22 and 40. He was very...
How'd he do it?
Well, he borrowed plots, actually. He bought plots from Sinclair Lewis.
Oh, that's the thing I was going to ask you about. Apparently there's some controversy about Chapter 7.
Yeah, right.
I didn't dig into it. What's the deal with it?
A guy named Frank Harris wrote an essay about the Bishop of Canterbury, who came to New York and looked at urban poverty in New York and then said, poverty in London is much worse than it is in New York. And London read this essay, and he absorbed it, and he used some of the same ideas when he talked about Bishop Morehouse giving a speech about poverty.
Was it just ideas, or did he like
It
lift
was
the
just,
entire thing?
I think it was ideas, and I haven't checked the language. I can't, I don't think he sat down and copied it. I think he'd read it as an article and then remembered it and, reproduced it, maybe using the same phrases, which happens if you read a lot and then you forget where you know something from, and then you include it
Sure.
somewhere. So
Sure.
I don't think he was intentionally sitting down to crib. There's no reason he would do that, just be a stupid exercise in plagiarism. So, but Frank Harris, the guy whose work was so-called borrowed, got pretty angry, and he demanded, the royalties for like 1/50th of the book, which is what he calculated the passages amounted to in the overall word count. So, yeah, it's not. I mean, he was writing very rapidly and very productive. He had an expensive life to keep up. He had a nice ranch. He had to take care of his. He had a wife. He also had a divorced wife and 2 daughters from that marriage that he had to support. He had other family members. His mother, Flora Wellman, he had to support. He had stepsisters he had to support. So I don't blame him for trying to make money as a writer, because a lot of people depended on him.
No, I don't have a problem with it either. Well, we've gone for about an hour. We've danced around a lot of different questions. Do you feel like we exhaustively covered everything that you wanted to talk about today?
I think we really have hit most of the major points. Yeah, I just can't emphasize enough the interesting parallels between, if you dig around today, the sort of incipient power of these, massively wealthy people in America, these billionaires, and the political power they're amassing and the power that they want, that I think London really was onto something in his era that also is relevant for us, particularly in this era.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of uncanny parallels going, for the past 100 years and into the future.
Yeah.
So I am recommending it to people. I recommend it to this entire audience and the jacket. As
Or the
I
Star
mentioned
Rover.
earlier.
The Star Rover.
Well,
It's also called the jacket sometimes, I guess.
It's also called the jacket. This was actually, that was kind of a dilemma for me when I was trying to get a hold of a copy of it.
Yeah.
Is that it's got 2 names. It's the jacket in England, but it's the Star Rover in America.
Yeah.
So it's known. So because I was so confused when I would do searches for it for the Star Rover, the jacket would come up, and I had to have someone explain to me that they were the same book, just known for some reason, known by different names. Yeah. I guess it had something to do with the publisher or how they were distributed in England.
It happens
and America.
Sometimes. Moby Dick was published as The Whale in England.
Oh, really?
Moby Dick here, yeah. We just know it as Moby Dick because we don't use the English title. Right. So, yeah.
Interesting, yeah. All right, well,
okay.
I'm up for doing more.
Yeah,
Jack
so
London,
I'll
if you
have
ever want to.
some suggestions.
The Sleeper Awakes would be of intrigue, but any of the ones that you listed would be interesting, and we can talk a little bit about that off air or through email or something like that. So I want to thank you, Dr. Cook, for joining us today, and thank you everybody for listening.
Okay.
All right.